time is 9:22 a.m. yesterday, March 25th, 2021. And for the next few minutes, you're going to see a long-lived supercell move into Alabama and produce a major tornado. So these are the storms, 9:30 a.m. Can you guess which one is going to become the supercell? Well, I'm going to tell you. It's going to be right there. You wouldn't suspect it. You might think it would be the one way up here to the north, or maybe one of these others. And that kind of shows you some of the randomness that we get on a storm day. There's just no way you can predict which one is going to become dominant several hours down the line. So let's take a look at the evolution for the rest of the 9 a.m. hour, and you can keep focused on that cell right there. So we follow that on up to the northwest, and I'm going to show you exactly where that is. It's going to be somewhere in there, right there near Paulding, Mississippi. So don't worry, we're going to refer to this in just a little bit. Let's check the satellite. There's how it looked yesterday around that time. Obviously, there's a boundary through the south part of the state, and we're getting storm formation along that line with some larger storms up there in northern Alabama. So it's the start of a stormy day in that region. Okay, so we pick things up during the 10 a.m. hour. So we're going to start out right there, and we run that forward. You're going to notice that a lot of these clusters and patches of cells begin dying off and showing more of an isolated appearance. And there's the storm of interest. We're going to switch over to the Birmingham radar at this point, a little bit further to the east. So there we are at 11 a.m. Our strong storm is on the Alabama-Mississippi border, and what you're going to see here during this next hour is the storm beginning to make a right turn. Maybe not that much of a right, but compared to the storms around it, these are a little bit more elevated. They're being carried mostly by the mid-level wind, and they're taking a path kind of like that, more towards the north. So let's run that. So there's the cell. You can see it's starting to get a little bit more intense. It kind of cuts right through that junk right to the south, and then the first tornado warning goes up. And there's our cell right there at the very end. Looks pretty impressive. Right by Moundville, and I could have sworn that there was a storm that went through there just last week. So already, just looking at the base velocity without any corrections, we can see that there's a very strong inbound towards the radar, which is up to the northeast. We also got to keep in mind this is pretty far away. The radar's way over here. So at this point, we are about 50 miles away from that radar. So we're up at about 4,000 to 5,000 feet, but that's some pretty impressive west to east flow. And that's going to correspond to the south side of that mesocyclone, the rear flank downdraft. And you can see it's right in that concavity. This is probably the rear flank downdraft. That's the forward flank downdraft, and then the inflow coming in like that. So now it's time to use storm relative velocity. And by using storm relative velocity, instead of considering velocity with respect to the radar, we are considering it with respect to the storm. So I tend to work this out manually because I like to be kind of intimate with the data. I can see that these outbounds are a lot stronger than the inbounds. So usually what I do is I kind of correct the storm motion vector and I set it up so it's representative of what the mesocyclone's doing. Now I think the meso may be kind of elevated in the mid parts of the storm, so it should be moving pretty quickly. And let's see here, I'm getting 25 out on the north side and about 51 in. Well, that could be better, but that's good enough. It corresponds to the dot right there in the center, and spectrum width not showing a whole lot at this point. We're still pretty far from the radar. And there's our first tornado warning for northeast Hale County. 12:20 p.m. confirmed tornado moving northeast at 40 miles an hour. So already we've got problems there south of Tuscaloosa. So what I'll do is I'll just run the animation through the 12 o'clock hour. Looks pretty impressive there, and you can see it's being seeded by some elevated stuff coming into the inflow area. And we get to the end of the loop right there, and it's just north of Centerville, heading into the southern Birmingham area. Let's do a quick review of the storm relative velocity. There's the circulation down to the south, and we bring that forward. Yeah, that's a pretty good couplet there. Some impressive velocities on that. And of course it goes through cycles. Looks a little bit weaker there as it moves northwest of Centerville. And it looks a lot less impressive at that point. Still has a meso. And I think it's about time to adjust the motion vector. Let me cut that down to 30 knots. And there's our couplet. So I think it's regenerating. And some very tight circulation coming together right there once again. And that looks like about, it's going to be just over 100 knots of shear at that location right there. So switch over to base reflectivity, and you can see that's right in that hook. Almost certainly has a tornado on the ground at that point. Now it's time for the 1 p.m. hour. So starting out, tornadic storm south of Birmingham. If I was living in that area there, I would be very worried. We'll run that animation forward. Tornado warnings are up. And the city just barely escapes big problems. So there we go. We end at 2 p.m. and at this point it's just east of the city heading for the interstate. And of course we want to review the velocity. Let's go back. So there's the storm, and I should probably zoom in really tight and follow that along. Yeah, there's a dog barking out there. All right, so a couple of very tight circulations once again. And just briefly about, let's see, that's going to be about 114. Kind of tightens up there. And you can just kind of follow that couplet as it crosses the interstate and heads up east of Birmingham. A little bit of a clutter pattern right there, but the storm is there. And it looks like at this point we end up with a little bit of disorganization. However, you can see the intensities on the broad scale really starting increasing. Now the radar is down to the southwest, and that looks like about 52 out and 40 in. That's about 90 knots of shear across that meso. So I think, we're once again redeveloping tornado-genetic circulations. So there we are, the 2 p.m. hour. I put a dot right there on Ohatchee. Some of you may have heard about that in the news. And that's where 5 people would shortly lose their lives. So let's run that forward. There's the animation. You can see the tornado warnings still on that storm. And the hook echo pattern crossing Ohatchee right there, leaving a trail of devastation. Let's take a look at that storm relative velocity, and we'll follow that on up to Ohatchee. You can see it looks like the circulation widens out a little bit. Storm reorganizing as it crosses the interstate. And it moves on up to the northeast there. And we can just follow along. Keep in mind the radar is down to the southwest. So we're seeing convergent rotation. And there goes that couplet on up to Ohatchee. So here's the final minutes of that approach into Ohatchee. You can see the strong outbounds from the radar indicating a good, well, this is storm relative, but 40 knots of outbound rotation. And I think that right there is probably the tornadic circulation. We are getting further and further away from the radar, so this is about 4,000 to 5,000 feet above the ground. It's not an optimal height for sampling the tornado, but let's run that forward. Here, I think the tornado is about right there. There it is again, the gate to gate, running 70 out, 33 in, about 100 knots. Yeah, this is not a great color scheme, but here, 72 out and about 30 in, still over 100 knots, just south of that T intersection. And it looks like it's just south of the town, about right there. And there it goes, heading northeast. And we get further and further away from the radar, and it gets harder to sample. But let me just run this back to where it's coming through the town itself, or just south of there. And it is rain-wrapped, so a very hazardous situation there. And of course, more would be coming towards that area from the west. So this would go on to be kind of a busy afternoon. Anyway, that's about all I wanted to cover. I didn't want to turn this into a 30-minute special. However, that should give you some food for thought and kind of show you how a storm evolves from its very earliest roots in the morning. So, let's take a look at this afternoon's weather. We have another Pacific system coming out of the Rockies. There it is, moving into West Texas. Not quite as powerful as the systems we've seen in the past couple weeks. There's a dry line just off the Cap Rock. That's not very well defined, really. Dew points to the east of there in the 40s, and behind it, 20s and teens. So, to me, that's not really strong enough to define a dry line. You can see even there, Del Rio 37, and the increase in moisture is very scarce. 42 in San Antonio, and then 57. That's where we get the better moisture in Houston. There is cold air behind the front, and I think it's important to use common sense. For example, if temperatures were in the upper 70s, mid-70s in the Panhandle, what kind of temperatures would you expect in a quiet weather pattern in New Mexico and El Paso? Well, there, you would probably expect 70s also, but that's not the case today. Just barely climbing up to 70 at El Paso. That's going to be on the cool side. They should be up near 80, and Albuquerque there, 52 with a southwest wind. So we're getting into the colder air back there as we go into the western U.S. And then we have our outgoing system in the East Coast. That one is the one that wreaked all that supercell destruction in Alabama. It's going on up into New England as if nothing ever happened. And in its wake, cold air coming in from the Great Lakes region. Up to the north, weak system in Manitoba, and there's that big blob of very cold polar air that's been gradually sinking to the southeast over the past few days, and that will be out of the picture in a couple more days, but not before advecting some cold air south into the northeastern U.S. And then up to the north, yeah, it's still cold up there. However, spring is close at hand, and we should start seeing that area beginning to warm over the coming weeks. Okay, well, I burned through all my available time doing that Alabama workup, but as that was a very noteworthy system, I think it was very important to go over some of that data, since we may not look at that again. So let's go ahead and go into the forecast this weekend. There's our Pacific system. Back in the Rockies and the Four Corners area, you can see the snow showers and the cold troughing. Let me get rid of that. Take a look at the thickness patterns, the red and blue dashed lines, and there's a little trough right in there. That's going to be the center of that cold air. We can drop a skew-t in that region, southwestern Utah, and you can see the steep lapse rates back in there. Yeah, that's some very cold air, especially in the mid and upper levels. So some of that cold air is going to be heading this way into the central U.S. And there it goes. It is taking its time. However, by later on Saturday, coming into Texas, the precip chances go up, and you can see the Gulf is open. Those pressure lines indicating a gradient off of the Gulf of Mexico. So that'll feed whatever's up there along that front. Okay, then things get very interesting in British Columbia and Washington. See that right there? Very powerful cold air mass coming off of southeast Alaska and the Gulf of Alaska. Yeah, that's moving into Seattle there. You can see some very strong cold air advection back behind that front, which is located right there. So there's going to be blustery there with quite a bit of snow in the higher elevations and rain down in the cities. And that will be heading this way. So I've advanced this up to Monday, and there you can see the very strong pressure gradient in the northwestern U.S. The front advancing into the Great Basin area, and back behind that front, look at how cold the air is. This is in that other cold trough. Dry adiabatic lapse rate up to about 400 millibars, and a very low tropopause. So that air definitely has some oomph to it, if you want to call it that meteorological term. And that's going to be quite a strong cold front heading into the central U.S. initially. And the eastern periphery of that makes some headway down into the southern plains, but there's more on the tail end that has yet to make its way southeastward. So that'll definitely have an impact on Texas around midweek. Even if it comes through dry, it is going to bring cold air in, and looks kind of rainy there on the Gulf Coast. Baroclinic system up there in the northeastern U.S. later next week, and a very strong baroclinic high across the central U.S. And then it looks like things kind of moderate for a while. Everywhere you look, high pressure, thermal ridging, and southwesterly flow. So that'll keep things quiet going into next weekend. So about Friday, there's our lee side trough, southerly flow. Actually, this has a component from a more northerly latitude coming in from South Carolina, Florida. So this is not deep Caribbean air by any means. And if we sample the moisture, bring up that sounding there, dew points in the 50s, and it's only got about 4,000 feet of depth. So the better moisture being driven south into Mexico. Then the next major change after that, well, looks like enough moisture for some high base storms late in the weekend of the 3rd and 4th. So a little bit of chase prospects there, but nothing too organized. And then it looks like kind of a quiet start there to April, and then things get going about a week into that month. And some more cold air building to the north. That could be the GFS bias. Yeah, see that up there, 1050 millibar high. So we shall see about that. But that could be another interesting ingredient to add to the mix. And that's all for this edition of Forecast Lab. I don't know if any of you have noticed, but starting yesterday, we have upgraded the rendering program, the non-linear editor. So the results are going to look much better, and we're going to be able to crank these videos out about 6 times as fast. So that means the updates are going to come a lot more quickly on storm days. Now, we are running a little bit late this evening. That's because I had some other stuff to catch up on. However, yeah, we're getting some improvements here. And also the closing credits, as I mentioned, if you are a Patreon supporter and you don't see your name in there, let me know. we'll get that fixed. Otherwise, we will talk to you again on Monday for the Patreon supporters and Tuesday for everybody else. Have a great weekend, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye.